Swindon Spring Festival, everyone. We hope all is well where you are. Now, we had hoped to be presenting live events in theatres and libraries and even old farms and parks in May in Swindon, but that nasty little virus and the restrictions to try to contain it means that we can now only have a virtual festival. So, welcome to this virtual session. Today's guest author has written a book called Threads of Life. This is it, Threads of Life. A loaded title, if ever there was one, with an explanatory subtitle, which is A History of the World Through the Eye of a Needle. It's a brilliant book, in my opinion, beautifully written, highly informative, and telling so many wonderful stories. So, please join me in giving a Swindon Spring Festival welcome to its author, textile artist, and much, much more, Clare Hunter. Clare, welcome.
Thank you. Welcome to you, Matt.
It's very nice to be speaking to you, and I'm really sorry we haven't got you live in Swindon. Maybe there will be another time. And by the way, you're speaking to us from Scotland, but have you ever been to Swindon?
No, you see, I haven't been to Swindon, so I was looking forward to that adventure had I been able to appear in person at the festival, but maybe another time.
Well, that would be very nice. That would be fantastic. Clare, we come to your book, and what we're going to do, those of you who are watching, Clare is going to talk about her book for a little while, and then she and I will have a chat, and I have some questions from festival followers who are also keen on this book and have asked me to ask Clare a question or two. Clare, I've already said I like the book, but I've no idea. If somebody said to me, what's it about? I'd say to them, it's much more than sewing. Much, much more. And they would say to me, but what's it about? Why was it written? And I would say, let's ask Clare Hunter. Clare, will you tell us the answer to that question?
Well, Threads of Life is really about, it explores the emotional, political and cultural significance of sewing. In the thousands of books written about needlework, you know, most of them deal with technique, but actually very few ask the question about why people do it, why people take that time and their skill to express something in sewing. And, you know, from Green Common campaigners, Mary Queen of Scots, prisoners of war, there are all sorts of people who have used sewing in order to have a voice, sometimes in the most desperate of circumstances. And I wanted to gather together these stories that are often neglected or forgotten, and put them in front of people to show them how valuable sewing is in other ways than just being a decorative art. Hello?
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh, yes. Still there. Sorry. And so I thought maybe I should set the tone by just doing a reading from the book, and that would just help people get into the feel of it. And I'm going to read a bit from chapter 5, which is called Journey. It is Christmas Eve in Southwest China in 1995. I am staying at the Hotel of Foreigners, entirely a dismal place of dark corridors and dangling electrical flexes. I have strung up an arm's length of tinsel and hung a golden star at the window, much to the glee of passing children. Now all is quiet. In my small room, the naked light bulb casts shadows over a pile of faded quilts, folded high in 2 iron beds. Just as I'm starting to feel homesick, the door opens to a slither of light from the hall, and in slides a woman, blurred in the low light, the hump of a bundle on her back. She is round in layers of indigo cotton, her hair tied up in a circle of woven red cloth, the traditional headdress of the Miao. Pressing her fingers to her lips, she lightly closed the door behind her. She looks round, points in silent delight at the tinsel, fingers the star, then she swings her bundle onto an empty bed, sits down beside it, and considers me with interest. I'm sitting on the other bed, and look back at her with similar interest. We just sit for a while, studying each other. She leans over and touches my skirt. I have a creaky Glasgow-style rose around its rim, especially for the strip, and she smooths her hand over the satin flowers and the roll background. She sits back and gives me a thumbs up sign. I point towards her embroidered jacket and return her approval with my own thumbs up. The woman gets up and reaches for her bundle. I think she is about to leave, But instead, she unties its knot and lets it spill out textiles, which she lays out one by one onto the bed. A red woven sash, a bronze jacket cradled for a second before being laid down, 2 baby carriers, their tying ribbons embroidered with tiny symbols, an apron thick and stitchery. There is more. The bed becomes canopied in encrusted cloth. She beckons me over. We examine the textiles together, her touching and stroking, lifting up this corner and that, willing me to see an intricacy here, wanting me to notice a technique there. She picks up the jacket and hugs it over her shoulder, then raises her arms and starts to dance in slow motion, turning heavily. She pulls at my arm to join her, and we twirl together in the low light of the room. I put my arm around her waist and dance her through a gay Gordon, a popular Scottish country dance, in steps suppressed with sound. It is obviously illicit, this visitation, but she is my Santa Claus, and I have become child again. She crisscrosses the baby carrier across her chest and ties at the back of her waist and mouths tiny baby cries. I laugh. And I'm hand stitching, machine sewing, threading a needle. She mirrors each mine with one of her own. We both do these things. We both sew. We are like one another. So the Meow have no written language. Instead, they embroider their myths, spiritual beliefs, and blessings to make libraries of their textiles, cloth filled with stories, stitched narratives passed down generation to generation to safeguard their history and preserve their culture. They are animists. They believe that everyone and everything has a spirit, which in their embroideries they manifest slowly, coaxing into being something which they believe already exists and is waiting to be transported from spiritual to the temporal world. They don't draw out their patterns, but sew their stories directly onto cloth through visual memory. In so practice, they can call it into being, into feeling with a stitcher's touch. But of course, sewn narratives have a long history. The Maya Tapestry, a sewn documentary about the Battle of Hastings in 1066, is one of the earliest to survive. 900 years old, this medieval narrative carries layers of meaning to tell of power, betrayal, war, and conquest. It has amongst its cast of over 1,350 men, animals, and birds, only 6 women. And yet it is thought to have been embroidered by women, by nuns in convents near Canterbury. It is also thought that these women inserted covert cameos of their lives after invasion, personal testimonies of loss, fear, abuse, traced out in illicit stitches. In medieval Europe, it was the English ecclesiastical embroidery which was deemed the highest form of art, above painting and illuminated manuscript. The embroiderers of the Opus Anglicanum, men as well as women, could win a salvation for their souls by such work, by their stitch service to the church, using gold and silver thread, precious jewels, and luxuriant fabric. They manifested God's light in textiles to animate the suffering of saints and the hallelujahs of angels under the fickle flicker of cathedral candlelight, and made faith tangible. And Mary, Queen of Scots, used embroidery as her political agent. When she was in captivity in England, she plotted with the Duke of Norfolk, then the most celebrated, richest, and most powerful man in England, to marry him, overthrow Elizabeth I, and return Scotland and England to Catholic rule. She embroidered him a cushion, smuggled out to message her resolve. A hand clutching a pruning knife descends from the divine of heaven. It is cutting away an old and fertile vine, Elizabeth, to allow the younger, more fecund vine to flourish, Mary. On its border are 6 pomegranates and acorns, boasts of Mary's proven fertility. Francis Walsingham, the spymaster, intercepted the cushion. It was cited in Norfolk's trial for treason, and he was executed. For the spectacular mass rallies of suffragettes, banners were key. Increasingly ridiculed as harridans, the suffragettes not only had to demonstrate widespread support and organisational capacity, but refute the accusation by their critics that they were becoming desexed by their political actions. They processed with hundreds of embroidered and appliqué banners in fabrics purposefully displaced from the drawing room, city streets, velvets, silk, brocade, to emphasise their female presence, to mark their protest as women. And in the 1980s, with the Women's Peace Camp at Greenland Common, Campaigners made banners from the fabric of home, textile, sheets, children's cast-off clothing, deliberately using the textiles of care to claim their role as protectors of their homes, families, and communities. But it wasn't only women who sewed. The actor Ernest Thesiger, best known for his portrayal of madman and murderess, most famous for his role as the maniacal Dr. Septimus Petronius in The Bride of Frankenstein, was not only celebrated for his acting, but for his embroidery. Volunteering to go to the front during the First World War, he found himself badly injured in the explosion. He was invalidated out of the trenches, and at home he was determined to find a way to support his war-damaged comrades. He set up the Disabled Soldiers Embroidery Industry to introduce the repetitive soothe of sewing as an effective treatment for mental anxiety and tremors brought about by shell shock, as an efficacious way to settle minds and hands. His initiative heralded the beginning of occupational therapy as we know it today. And in the mid-19th century, tailors, finding their trade threatened by a growing swell of seamstresses and particularly allied to the reformist and temperance movements, began to make pictorial patchworks, using thousands of scraps of fabric and taking years of labour. Their artistic masterpieces were exhibited widely as exemplars of industry, sobriety, and a tailor's skill. Patchwork, the joining together of fabric pieces, has in many cultures a spiritual significance. In parts of China, when a baby was born, the tradition was for neighbours to bring its mother a small piece of fabric for her to make what was called the hundredth family's coat. The idea being that the many pieces, for many people, sewn with many stitches, would ensure collective protection for the baby. The layering fabric, as with quilts, was also spiritually efficacious. Layers represented the fusion of temporal, spiritual, and magical worlds into harmonious force. If layers of fabric or patchwork pieces came from the clothing of family members who had died, they represented the continuing connection between generations and the transference of the spirit of the dead to the living to create combined physical and emotional strength. When America's gay community in the 1980s began to be decimated by the AIDS epidemic, the public and the politicians seemed to turn their faces to the wall. The Names Memorial Quilt Project came into being to create a visible, unforgettable, large-scale visual lament and make of mere statistics the human stories of loved ones lost. Relatives, friends, and lovers of someone who had died through AIDS were invited to sew a 6-foot by 3-foot panel the size of a burial plot, and animated straps of cloth, often from the clothing of the person they had loved, from jeans, t-shirts, ties, to capture an individual life and personality. On the 11th of October 1987, nearly 2,000 panels were laid out in the Mall of Washington, D.C. to make an encrusted carpet of mourning and celebration as a textual evocation of lost lives. There are now over 48,000 panels. In 1970s Chile, under Pinochet's regime, the country was silenced by terror, brutality, and escalating poverty. Annexed from the outside world, women in the shanty towns of Santiago began to create small patchwork pictures to document repression and degradation. These were smuggled out, overlooked by border guards as simply needlework, women's work. And it was these patchworks which alerted the outside world to the human cost of Chile's tragedy. The African slaves of 19th century America were severed from their traditions, the magical significance of their visual culture. With the majority forbidden to learn to read or write, it was challenging to conserve what we could of cultural ancestry, never mind document their current experiences. One slave, Harriet Powers, from Georgia, made quilts, seemingly pious illustrations of white American Christian instruction. Her Bible quilts harbored defiance, because the biblical stories she chose feature stories of escape, of freedom, and the patterns, techniques, and symbols she employed preserved the lost Africa and conserved its cultural inheritance. A small tray cloth was found recently in a jumble sale in Bristol. On it was an embroidery of the arrival of women, POWs, at the Changi camp in Singapore in the Second World War. It was possibly the only eyewitness account of these women's experience that had survived a precious piece of war documentary found in a jumble sale. Rowan and Shaggy sewed other cloths. They made 3 patchwork quilts, ostensibly to comfort those in the camp hospital, but in reality as a means to smuggle out messages of love, patriotism, historical survival and hope of reunion to their husbands, fathers and sons segregated in the adjoining camp. In Shanghai, women sewed in the most desperate of circumstances. They scavenged fabric from flour sacks, unpicked threads and cloths that had rotted in the sun, safeguarded precious needles and sewed a small triumph of resourcefulness and expression of self in the anonymity of captivity. They made signature cloths, threading their stitched autographs to register their existence over and over again, when they thought they might have been forgotten, when they feared that they themselves might forget. In 19th century Germany, the seamstress Agnes Richter was incarcerated in Heidelberg's lunatic asylum. There, she refashioned her regulating jacket, expertly remodeling it into a jacket of style. And she embroidered it inside and out with a torrent of largely indecipherable words, amongst which were repeated ich and I, like the POWs in Shanghai, marking herself down, asserting her presence. Why did Agnes Richter, so clever with her needle, choose to embroider her words in jagged, seemingly clumsy stitching when she was so skilled at sewing? It seemed that hers was a desperate attempt to physically capture the feeling of her mental fragmentation, to visualize her anguish, catch hold of it somehow, live it. People choosing cloth and needle and thread to tell their story, protect their families, mourn their dead. To finish, I'm going to read a short piece from the end of the book, which sums up why people sew. Needlework can record history, convey complex social information about people's status, relationships, beliefs, origin, and allegiances. It can conserve memory, protecting and preserving personal and collective testimony. It has a vital role to play in archiving tradition and telling people stories in a medium that carries emotional and physical meaning. Fabric and thread can convey a prayer, trace out a map, proclaim a manifesto, send out a warning, bestow a blessing, celebrate a culture, and commemorate lives lived and lost. Lives expressed not just through images, but through texture and colour, different kinds of stitches, the various processes of piecing, patching, recycling, quilting, to more clearly articulate the different layers of our humanity and manifest the fabric of our lives. Sewing is a way to mark our existence in cloth, patterning our place in the world, voicing our identity, sharing something of ourselves with others, and leaving the indelible evidence of our presence in stitches held fast by our touch.
Thank you very much, Claire.
My pleasure.
Delightful. It's great. A great book ends on the word touch. And I mentioned to you that I love this book. I mentioned at the start. And not only because it's informative, not only because it's beautifully written, but you actually, and you're quite a serious woman in the things you care about and the work you've done in Scotland and so on. But you have a wicked sense of humor. And if you don't mind me telling viewers, and it will lead to a question in a minute, Claire, and that is the question, how did you come to write this book? But you mentioned a guest writer appearing up there in Scotland. Sorry to say up there, I think of myself as down here. And you're in a writing workshop, and he asks everyone what they're writing, and people say, oh, a crime novel, a romance, and so on. And he comes to you, and you say, you're writing a book about the emotional and social history through sewing. And he says, ah, and he leans forward with his chin on his elbows and says something like, so, Claire, can you imagine me going into a bookshop and saying, because they all want to write bestsellers, all these people in the writing room, in saying to the bookseller, have you got that bestseller on the emotional and social history through sewing? And and it's a bit of a put down. But anyway, later on you read a passage from your work in progress, and this writer appears to like it, and you think, well, I've sort of passed one test there, you know, the test of prejudice and so on. And then the following week you come back and he says to you, how's your book on knitting going? And you think, and you say, ah, well, I can't fight all the battles. And I chuckled at that. But Clare, how did you come to write it? Because there you are, a textile artist in Scotland, you've got plenty to work on, you're doing banners, you're doing all sorts of great things. Why did you write this book and how?
Well, obviously, as you say, my background is in textiles, doing community textiles, making banners, etc. And I'd also created a couple of exhibitions in Glasgow on the social meaning of textiles. One which looked at textiles that were made by communities throughout Great Britain, and another one that was looking at textiles being made by people in different parts of the world, as part of cooperatives, as part of political movements in different ways. And so I'd always been, in a sense, gathering these kinds of stories. And I I embarked on a creative writing course at the University of Dundee. And when it came to the final part of that, to write the dissertation, I actually didn't have that crime novel to hand. And I didn't have the romance to hand or the memoir. And I thought, well, actually, maybe I should just write that book about sewing. And that's really how it came about. And I put 3 chapters together as part of my dissertation. And it was my professor and tutors who said, you should make a book out of this. And I thought, well, why not? What I didn't realize at that point was, obviously, I thought I was already very well versed in the world of sewing and needlework. But as I started research, I realized how little I knew. And the research itself took the next couple of years as I discovered more and more stories. And because what I wanted to do in the book was not tell so much about the object of the sewn, but about the people who had sewn it and their story, then I had to then explore much more political and social circumstances in order to set the context of the needlework that I was talking about.
And how did you go about that? Because obviously some things were personal experience. For example, Greenham Common, you went there and you saw textiles being used on the fence and so on. But then you write of Pinochet in Chile, you write of Vernichtung durch Arbeit, that the Nazis using sewing as a means of getting things done and getting rid of a whole lot of people. And you range right across the world, and the Bayeux tapestry and so on. So some of these things are clearly out of personal experience, but where did you go to get all this information?
Well, I started looking at needlework books, but as I said, then in most needlework books, there's very little of the social or political history behind the sewing itself. And so I had to then go further afield. Obviously, these days we are blessed with Google, and Google was a great support in beginning to get the first touchstones of what I might look for further. So I spent hours putting in various kind of, men sewing and sewing for politics, banner making, all sorts of things to see what it would throw up. And each thing led to something else. But then the difficulty came when I had to find out more about that thing, because the sad thing with much of needlework history is that very little of it is documented. And so that really became a kind of Sherlock Holmes task of teasing out from either other curators or from history books. I began to read a whole wide-ranging selection of books I would never have thought I would look at, just to find nuggets of information. And eventually I began to gather up these little nuggets and piece them together, very much like making a patchwork quilt.
And it actually feels to me by the 2.5 pages of acknowledgements that it was quite a community enterprise and there were other people involved, which is such a lovely feeling. And
it is a lovely feeling.
Was it?
It is, and also that thing about actually meeting other people who shared the same passion and who cared about what I was trying to write about and were willing to share their stories and show me textiles and tell me other stories. And of course, textile curators are a font of information because they have access to all those other textiles that we never see in museums because they have all those orphaned objects in their collection. And some of those are some of the most poignant stories, even if their whole history isn't known.
Mm. And Claire's book is brilliant in that it has single words for each chapter. Fantastic words: power, frailty, captivity, journey, protest, place, value, art, work, voice, etc. And each of the chapters relates to that particular word, and I just love it. Now, I have a very particular question from someone in a reading group who also loved this book, and she says, "Can you ask Claire, are some stitches used more for misery and others more for happiness?"
Oh, what a wonderful question. Now, you see, would I ever be able to answer that question? Obviously, some stitches are used because they are more fitting to sitting together sewing. So you'll find, like with Cantor quilts, they use just a simple running stitch. They're working on layers of fabric and unpicked saris, so they're working on lengths of cloth. So if you imagine a group of people sitting down, it's easier to stitch together if you're all using the same stitch and traveling in the same direction. So there's some stitches like that. There are other stitches like chain stitch, which are used really for magical reasons because the chain cannot be broken. So often a chain stitch is used in sewing, which is going to be some kind of talismanic a piece of clothing for somebody who somebody loves. And they use a chain stitch as a protective guard against evil spirits penetrating that clothing. So some stitches have particular meanings attached to them that go further than the technique of the stitch itself, and others are more practical. But whether there's that idea, you have to ask that question. I'll ask that question through my Twitter account and see if I get any response about whether some people choose a particular stitch because they're in the mood for that stitch. I'm not sure.
Is there then, however, because you range far and wide across the world in this book, is there an embroidery stitch that is used universally?
Well, I would say running stitch is used universally, and that's just when the needle goes in and out of the cloth. It's the simplest of stitches, and it's used in basic sewing for hemming or for anything like that, but also used in embroidery, using running stitch to mark out patterns and mark out images. Cross stitch, chain stitch, as I said, there are some stitches that are universal. And then there are many other stitches, developments from those simple rudimentary stitches that are particularly known by the area that they came from or the country they came from.
Terrific, Claire. We are coming to the end of our time, and if we were live in a theatre, we would have longer, but virtual events need to be shorter for one reason or another. And there's a key question I want to ask you in view of what this book covers. It covers joyful occasions and sad occasions and all sorts of occasions in between. Do you think there is any sewing to be done to tell the story of the times that we're living through right now, the very reason why you are virtual and not live with us? In other words, the virus that is keeping us all locked away and isolated. Is sewing going on now to tell this story in some way or other?
Well, actually, of course, the answer to that is yes, Matt, but in a very sad way, because there is a huge explosion of people sewing masks, of sewing garments for doctors and nurses. And in the Middle End, I live in Scotland, as with many other places in Britain, we are sewing bags of thanks, which are like large toilet bags for nurses, etc., people in the healthcare, to be able to put their uniform straight into the bag and put the bag with the contents straight into the washing machine to lower the risk of them having been contaminated by having to touch the uniform over much when being in contact with people who have the virus. And so, yes, the internet is full of different YouTube videos or blogs about people who are sewing in order to help the NHS at this moment.
Interesting that, because you said sadly, tragically, and then all the examples you've given are actually something functional, something directly useful. And in my question, I was also hoping that there might be something that is to do with the history or some work of art that comes out of this period that helps sustain the human spirit in some way or other. Do you think that's likely too?
I think that is likely to. I think we've seen through history that at times of crisis, at times of anxiety, then people have either individually or collectively come together to express those feelings in cloth and thread. And so I'm sure that as these days emerge, then more pieces will come to light that people have been working on, either as a personal expression of what they're experiencing, or as or collectively, obviously working social distancing collectively to work in small pieces that come together in order to make larger works of art that tell of, as I say, different people's experiences. Yes, I'm sure that will happen.
Clare, thank you very much. And the home of the Swindon Festival of Literature is a place where we love what are commonly called arts and crafts, and we would really look forward to welcoming you here one day. Viewers, remember this book, even though bookshops aren't open, you can get it online. Online services are deemed essential, and so one can still order books. So I hope you do. Clare Hunter, thank you very much from the Swindon Spring Festival for coming and taking part in this virtual event. Until we meet again.
Yeah, thank you very much, Matt, and I hope to meet you in person one day.
Until we meet again.
And to see Swindon.
That would be great. Until we meet again, everyone out there, keep well, and especially to you, Clare, thank you very much, and keep well, and goodbye. Goodbye.
Everyone, bye now.
Thank you for watching this virtual session at the Swindon Spring Festival of Literature and the Arts 2020. We do hope you enjoyed it. And we also hope that you will join us for the rest of this virtual festival. Here for you are details of the author you have just watched, their book, and our online information. Thank you very much for joining us, and keep well till we meet again.